Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, January 14th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 81.5 degrees, with a low of 52.1, so expect a mild winter day perfect for getting out and about. Coming up, we'll examine the reasons behind President Trump's move to cut federal funding to entire sanctuary states and break down why inflation is lingering above target levels, even as broader economic indicators show signs of cooling. Plus, other key stories from around the world, including updates on global markets and local community impacts. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're starting this half hour with a major escalation on immigration and money. Ethan is with us to break it down. Ethan, what exactly did President Trump announce?
He used a speech at the Detroit Economic Club yesterday, January 13th, to say that starting February 1st, the administration will withhold federal funds not just from sanctuary cities, but from entire states that have them. Outlets like ABC affiliates via the Associated Press and the San Francisco Chronicle say this is a big expansion of earlier threats that were mostly aimed at specific cities or counties. The president claimed sanctuary policies, quote, protect criminals at the expense of American citizens, end quote, and said they, quote, breed fraud and crime, end quote. But he did not spell out which pots of money are at stake, telling reporters in Washington, quote, you'll see, it'll be significant, end quote.
So when we say sanctuary jurisdictions, what does that actually mean in practice?
There's no single legal definition in federal law, and that's part of the fight. Generally, according to coverage from CBS News and the Los Angeles Times, we're talking about cities, counties, or states that limit how much local police help with federal immigration enforcement. That can mean not holding people longer just because Immigration and Customs Enforcement files what is called a detainer request. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, keeps a list of roughly 36 of these jurisdictions, most of them led by Democrats.
Which places are on that list, and how big are we talking here?
That list includes whole states like California, Connecticut, New York, and Illinois, along with big cities such as Boston, New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Counties like Baltimore County in Maryland and Cook County in Illinois are also labeled sanctuary jurisdictions by the Justice Department. An earlier list in 2025 was even longer, but according to CBS and the Los Angeles Times, it drew criticism because the criteria were really murky. After that pushback, the department scaled it back and tried to clarify who counts.
The president's saying money will be cut off. Has he tried this before?
Yes, this isn't coming out of nowhere. In his second term, he signed an order in January of 2025 called, quote, protecting the American people against invasion, end quote, telling agencies to deny funds to places that do not cooperate with immigration enforcement. And during his first term, in 2017, his Justice Department tried to put immigration strings on public safety grants like the Burn Justice Assistance Grant and cops policing funds. Courts in cases like City of Chicago versus Sessions and City of Philadelphia versus Sessions said those conditions violated the Constitution's spending rules and were unrelated to the original purpose of the grants.
So with this new threat to whole states, how do the courts factor in now?
A key moment came last August, when federal judge William Orrick in California issued a preliminary injunction blocking broad funding cuts to more than 50 jurisdictions, including San Francisco, Seattle, and Chicago. According to Courthouse News Service and Ninth Circuit summaries, he found the orders likely unconstitutional and said they caused irreparable harm by throwing state and local budgets into chaos. He emphasized that the executive branch cannot unilaterally rewrite the conditions Congress attached to money it already appropriated, pointing to the separation of powers and a law called the Impoundment Control Act. That injunction is on appeal, and the Ninth Circuit's questioning in December suggested real skepticism about blanket cuts tied to immigration.
With this February 1st deadline coming up in a little over 2 weeks, what legal tools do states have to push back?
Legal experts interviewed by groups like the Center for American Progress and CalMatters expect very fast lawsuits. They point to Supreme Court precedents like South Dakota versus Dole in 1987, which said any federal conditions on spending must be crystal clear, related to the program's purpose, and not too coercive. Another big case is NFIB versus Sebelius in 2012, where the court said threatening to yank a huge share of a state's budget, such as Medicaid, could be like putting, quote, a gun to the head, end quote. The twist now is a June 2025 decision called Trump versus Casa, Inc., where the court limited broad nationwide injunctions, meaning the administration might still go after places that are not yet in court, at least until each case is filed and decided.
You mentioned Medicaid and big money. What specific programs are at risk if this goes forward?
We are not just talking about small discretionary grants. According to detailed reporting by Newsweek, the California Budget Center, and the National Immigration Law Center, the administration has signaled that everything from Medicaid and food assistance to childcare, social services, even some transportation and education funds could be targeted. In states like California and New York, federal dollars make up more than 1/3 of the entire state budget, easily over $170 billion a year in California alone. That's why budget analysts say even the threat of cuts creates major uncertainty for hospitals, schools, and social service agencies.
Let's start with healthcare. What's happening on Medicaid specifically?
Minnesota has become a kind of test case. Earlier this month, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services told the state it plans to withhold roughly $515 million every quarter, which is about 1/4 of Minnesota's federal Medicaid funding tied to what it calls 14, quote, high-risk, end quote, programs. Over a full year, that would be about $2 billion. Federal officials point to a massive $9 billion fraud scandal involving 98 defendants, many of them Somali American, accused of ripping off Medicaid, child care, and food benefit programs.
And Minnesota officials say that's not just about fraud, they see a political motive?
They absolutely do. Governor Tim Walz and the State Human Services Commissioner, Shireen Gandhi, filed an administrative appeal yesterday, January 13th, arguing this is a political vendetta wrapped in an anti-sanctuary crackdown. They say the cuts would destabilize care for more than 1.2 million residents, many of them low-income, disabled, or elderly. Minnesota is also challenging a separate federal operation called Operation Metro Surge, which has sent extra immigration agents into the Twin Cities area, saying that, combined with the funding squeeze, amounts to an unconstitutional federal intrusion.
How about California and New York on the healthcare front?
In California, advocates tell CalMatters that so-called 90-day notices are targeting Medi-Cal reimbursements tied to immigrant health coverage, potentially putting $10 to $20 billion at risk. The worry is that California's decision to use state funds to cover many undocumented residents will now be punished by federal rule changes. New York, according to state budget analysts quoted by Newsweek, faces threats to billions in Medicaid reimbursements that support coverage for more than 4 million enrollees. One proposed rule would penalize states that use their own dollars to extend coverage to undocumented immigrants, effectively forcing them to choose between covering people and keeping full federal funding.
Beyond healthcare, what's the story with food assistance like SNAP?
The Agriculture Department, led by Secretary Brooke Rollins, has warned sanctuary-heavy states that if they do not share detailed SNAP recipient data, including Social Security numbers and addresses, with immigration authorities, they could lose federal administrative funds. New York Comptroller Brad Lander estimates that could force the state to pick up about 1/4 of SNAP costs on its own, affecting around 3 million recipients. Coverage from outlets like KARE11 and Arcamax says that might mean lower benefits or stricter eligibility unless courts step in. There is already a lawsuit in federal court in Massachusetts arguing those data demands violate privacy laws and the Administrative Procedure Act.
And childcare, welfare, broader social services, those are in the crosshairs too, right?
Yes, those are already part of an active fight. On January 6th, the Health and Human Services Department suddenly halted more than $10 billion in funding spread across 5 Democratic-led states: California, New York, Minnesota, Illinois, and Colorado. That included about $7 billion in temporary assistance for needy families, roughly $2.4 billion in child care and development fund subsidies, and close to $870 million in social services block grants. 3 days later, on January 9th, federal judge Arun Subramanian in New York issued a temporary restraining order pausing those cuts, and states filed new motions on January 13th asking him to extend that protection against the looming February 1st deadline.
Are other kinds of grants, like for policing or infrastructure, being pulled into this too?
The administration has signaled that virtually any pot of money could be leveraged if a state or city is on the sanctuary list. That ranges from public safety grants like Burn Jag and COPS, to small business administration loans, to transportation and education funds. For example, according to local Minnesota coverage, roughly 8,000 SBA loans there have already been suspended under the banner of a crackdown on, quote, suspected scammers, end quote. Courts have repeatedly said that attaching immigration conditions to things like highway funds or Title I education money is not related enough to the original purpose, but the White House appears willing to push those boundaries again and see what survives.
How are state and city leaders reacting to all of this?
Many of them are drawing a hard line. In New York, which is itself a sanctuary state, Mayor Zohran Mamdani said, quote, "Our values and our laws cannot be bargaining chips," end quote, and told CBS News his office has reached out to the White House with no response so far. Governor Kathy Hochul's team says they'll keep cooperating on what they call truly dangerous criminals, but they reject any attempt to punish, quote, hardworking families, end quote, and they're promising an aggressive court fight based on earlier legal wins. In California, Attorney General Rob Bonta has labeled the move, quote, lawless, end quote, and cited the 10th Amendment's anti-commandeering doctrine, which bars Washington from forcing state officials to carry out federal immigration work.
What about Minnesota and the other Midwestern states that have been in the spotlight lately?
Minnesota officials say they will appeal every administrative decision and every cutoff notice they get. They argue, as reported by local outlets and public radio, that tying long-term health care and child care funding to the sanctuary debate is a blatant attempt to make an example of a politically blue state. There is also a multi-state coalition now, led by New York Attorney General Letitia James, suing in federal court in Manhattan over these new conditions. 12 states, including New York, California, and Minnesota, are also challenging related rules on gender policy that they say are being used as an extra lever to threaten grants.
The president defends this by saying sanctuary policies lead to crime and fraud. What does the data show?
It depends which numbers you look at. Supporters of the crackdown point to things like that $9 billion Minnesota fraud case in Justice Department reports of more than 13,000 rejected ICE detainers in California in 2025. Conservative outlets, including analyses highlighted by the Heritage Foundation and the Center for Immigration Studies, say encounters with non-citizens who have criminal records have risen. But a lot of academic research and big city crime data tell a different story.
Walk us through that other side of the evidence.
NYPD numbers show that in 2025, New York City's murders fell by just over 20% and shootings by nearly 1/4, leading city leaders and the New York Times to call it the safest big city in America. Chicago, another major sanctuary city, reported about 1/3 fewer homicides, according to the Chicago Tribune. Studies from the University of California, Irvine, Stanford University, and the University of Texas at Austin, published over the last year or so, find no overall crime increase linked to sanctuary policies. In some cases, researchers told the Los Angeles Times and Cal Matters that limiting local involvement in immigration enforcement actually improves trust in police and boosts crime reporting in immigrant communities.
Beyond law and order arguments, are there broader economic concerns tied to this funding standoff?
Yes, the economic ripple effects could be enormous. Financial outlets like Go Trade News, citing the Associated Press, warn that yanking or even threatening to yank federal funds from hubs like California and New York could trigger what they call, quote, unexpected regional economic volatility, end quote. That means stress on state budgets, potential layoffs in hospitals, schools, and social service organizations, and indirect hits to consumer spending if low-income families lose benefits. Investors are being advised to watch the court hearings leading up to February 1st because a sudden cutoff could spook markets tied to municipal bonds and healthcare providers.
Some legal experts are even using the phrase constitutional crisis. What do they mean by that in this context?
They are worried about what happens if the administration presses ahead despite court orders. Analysis from law commentators at places like UBG Law notes that if agencies start withholding money that judges have explicitly protected, officials could face civil contempt findings. That would raise stark questions about whether the executive branch is obeying the judiciary, striking at the heart of separation of powers. It is also why you hear so much talk about the Impoundment Control Act, which says presidents cannot simply sit on or redirect money Congress has already told them to spend.
So bottom line, with just over 2 weeks until that deadline, where do things stand this morning?
As of today, January 14th, no funds have actually been halted under the new, broader February 1st threat, though some targeted actions, like the Minnesota Medicaid plan and the early January social service freezes, are already tied up in court. Multiple lawsuits are underway from Massachusetts to California, and most legal scholars expect at least one of these cases to reach the Supreme Court later this year. The administration is betting that narrower injunctions after Trump versus Casa will let it move faster against jurisdictions that have not yet sued, while opponents argue that the core spending clause problems have not changed since those earlier Chicago and Philadelphia rulings. So the stage is set for an intense legal and political showdown, with millions of residents, healthcare, food assistance, and state budgets hanging in the balance.
A lot at stake. And a fast-moving story. Ethan, thanks for walking us through it. Inflation has been drifting down, but a lot of people say their budgets are still getting squeezed. Chloe, what did yesterday's new inflation report actually show?
The Labor Department's report yesterday showed overall consumer prices in December were up 2.7% from a year earlier, exactly the same as in November and down from 3% in September. Core inflation, which strips out food and energy, was 2.6% year over year and just 0.2% month to month. Economists told outlets like Yahoo News Canada that's a sign inflation is slowly stabilizing after 4 straight years of elevated increases post-COVID. But when you peel back the headline number, the stuff families need every week is where the pain really is.
So on the surface, the numbers look calm. But the grocery bills tell a different story. How are food prices hitting households?
Grocery prices jumped 0.7% just in December, which is a big one-month move for something as basic as food at home, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics breakdown that Yahoo News Canada highlighted. Year over year, staples like uncooked ground beef are up about 15.5%, frozen fish and seafood nearly 9%, and roasted and instant coffee close to 19%. Flour, bread, and even rice are still inching higher. A progressive group called the Groundwork Collaborative told reporters that overall, supermarket prices are roughly 25% higher than before the pandemic, far outpacing what most people's paychecks have done.
Are there any spots in the grocery aisle where people are actually seeing relief?
There are a few, but they're not enough to offset the rest. Eggs are down roughly 21% from a year ago. Potatoes have slipped a few percent, and fuels like propane and firewood are cheaper, according to that same government data cited by Yahoo News Canada. The problem is, the items that dropped are often things families can more easily substitute, while the big jumps are in everyday proteins, produce, and coffee. So even with some declines, the total at the register keeps surprising people in the wrong direction.
And energy is another big driver of monthly bills, especially in the winter. What's going on with heating and electricity costs?
The Anchorage Daily News, summarizing Associated Press reporting, says natural gas prices have been the standout shock, up about 10.8% over the past year and more than 4% just in December. That's tied directly to the Arctic cold snap we've been living through since late November, which sent spot prices at the key Henry Hub benchmark from about $1.23 to nearly $3.40 per unit. Those gas spikes feed right into utility bills, pushing electricity costs higher by almost 3% in a month and nearly 7% over the year for many households. For people heating with gas, it turns what should be a manageable winter into a real budget strain.
How much of that is just the freak weather, and how much is something more structural in the energy market?
Analysts quoted by PBS and ING say the cold weather was the immediate spark, especially a sudden stratospheric warming event that disturbed the polar vortex and helped drive wind chills down to around 11 degrees in Atlanta and below zero in Chicago as of today. But they argue the deeper issue is the surge in liquefied natural gas exports, which are up roughly between 22 and 40% compared with a year earlier under President Trump's so-called energy dominance push. Those exports, described by Public Citizen in their research, effectively link American gas prices to more volatile global markets and create a higher floor at home. Add in pipeline bottlenecks, like delays on the Blackcomb project due to steel shortages and maintenance, and you get a system where any weather shock bites consumers harder.
Do we have any sense of whether those energy prices might ease later this year, or is this the new normal?
The Federal Energy Information Administration projects natural gas production will climb to around 109 billion cubic feet per day in 2026, which should add some supply and, in theory, take a little pressure off prices. The Public Citizen estimates that in 2025 alone, prioritizing exports over domestic supply cost American households roughly $12 billion in higher utility bills. So even if prices back off somewhat once the cold abates, groups that follow this closely are warning we may be stuck with structurally higher energy costs than before the export boom. That's one reason economists tell outlets like NPR that rate policy at the Fed can't fully fix what's basically a supply and infrastructure problem.
Let's go back to the overall inflation picture for a moment. You mentioned the December report is especially important because of earlier data problems. What was that about?
KATU's National Desk, which is part of Sinclair's network, points out that this is the first so-called clean inflation report we've had in about 3 months. A 6-week government shutdown last fall forced the Bureau of Labor Statistics to lean on carry-forward estimates for October and November instead of fresh survey data. Economists suspect that may have slightly understated inflation in those months. So December's numbers, with a 0.3% overall monthly rise, likely give a truer snapshot of the underlying pressure heading into the spring of 2026.
When you add in housing and other services, how broad-based is this inflation now?
Shelter costs are still a big part of the story. The Anchorage Daily News notes that rent and owners' equivalent rent were up about 0.4% for the month and more than 3% over the year. That single category made up more than half of December's overall price increase. Transportation and medical care also ticked higher, while used cars finally gave a bit of relief, down about 1.1% in December, according to KATU's coverage. So outside of a few goods categories that are flat or falling, most essential services still feel pretty hot.
You mentioned tariffs earlier. There was a lot of fear they'd reignite inflation. How much are they actually to blame here?
According to research discussed by the St. Louis Fed and New York Fed President John Williams in a speech on Monday, President Trump's 2025 tariffs, which the White House branded Liberation Day tariffs, added maybe about 0.5 to 0.7 percentage points to both the headline and core inflation rates. That's far less than the 1 to 2 full percentage points some economists had warned about when the package was first rolled out. The impact was muted because the administration quietly carved out big consumer items like coffee and pasta, and retailers chose to absorb some of the higher import costs by accepting lower profit margins. You can see that in categories like appliances and furniture, which the government data show are actually a few percent cheaper than a year ago, even as overall prices keep climbing.
So if tariffs are a smaller piece, what are economists saying is really driving the stubborn inflation now?
Energy and certain commodities are the main culprits. Utilities are up around 13% over the past year, largely due to those liquefied natural gas dynamics and higher input costs, according to summaries from ING and S&P Global. There have also been shocks in metals like copper and tin that filter into durable goods and construction. Economists quoted by Trading Economics and Consumer Affairs stress that for food, in particular, it's a mix of lingering pandemic supply disruptions, seasonal factors, and companies holding on to fatter profit margins, not just trade policy.
How is Wall Street reading all of this, especially with the next Federal Reserve meeting coming up in about 2 weeks?
Markets mostly cheered the report because, as Yahoo News Canada notes, it confirmed that inflation isn't re-accelerating, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average pushed past roughly 47,000 yesterday. But traders who follow the Fed's moves closely, via tools like the CME FedWatch, now see a roughly 95 to 97% chance that the central bank holds its key interest rate between 3.5 and 3.75% at the late January meeting. Gregory Dacko, chief economist at EY Parthenon, told KATU the data give the Fed, quote, no reason for immediate cuts, end quote. In other words, rate hikes are likely done for now, but the rapid-fire cuts some in the market had been dreaming about are probably off the table in the near term.
That's interesting, because President Trump is loudly calling for big rate cuts. How is he responding to this latest report?
Within hours of the data coming out yesterday, President Trump was on his Truth Social platform calling them, quote, great, LOW, end quote, inflation numbers, and again demanding that Fed Chair Jerome Powell slash rates right away. At a Detroit Economic Club speech, covered by the Washington Post and Michigan's Bridge news site, he credited his tariffs with strong economic growth in the final quarter of last year, and called Powell a, quote, jerk, end quote. The tone underscores the intense political pressure on the Fed just 2 weeks before its next policy meeting. That pressure is mounting, even as Trump's own economic approval rating has slipped to around 36% in recent Marist polling.
There's also that Justice Department subpoena involving Chair Powell. How does that factor into the Fed's independence concerns?
The subpoena, which came last week, focuses on Powell's testimony from June of last year about a roughly $2.5 billion renovation of a Federal Reserve office complex. Powell has publicly described it as a pretext, suggesting the real goal is to discredit him and potentially justify removing him before his term is up. Analyses on Investopedia and the futures firm ADMIS warn that this kind of legal and rhetorical attack can chill honest communication from the Fed and make it harder for policymakers to stick to the data when the White House wants faster cuts. For a central bank that's supposed to be insulated from day-to-day politics, it is an unusually direct confrontation.
Meanwhile, from the Fed's own side, what are Powell and other officials saying about the path ahead for inflation?
In a video statement on January 11th, covered by the Anchorage Daily News, Powell said the inflation effects from tariffs would probably peak in the first quarter of this year and then fade as one-off shocks. But he warned that core essentials like housing, which are still running more than 3% higher over the year, remain sticky, and that the fall shutdowns data issues make it harder to read the trend with confidence. New York Fed Chief John Williams has suggested that if current patterns hold, inflation could drift back toward the Fed's 2% target by about 2027. That's a long runway, which is why officials are counseling patience rather than big celebratory rate cuts.
From voters' perspective, though, 2.7% doesn't feel like success. Why is there such a disconnect between the inflation rate and how angry people feel?
Economists writing in outlets like The Guardian and Consumer Affairs say it's all about the difference between inflation rates and price levels. The rate tells you how fast prices are climbing, and that has slowed a lot from the peak, but it doesn't roll them back to where they were. People remember their 2019 grocery bill, and now they're paying about 25% more for the same cart, plus higher utilities and rent. So even if wages have risen, the University of Michigan's latest sentiment survey finds nearly 2/3 of Americans feel they're falling behind, and that gap shows up in every poll about the cost of living.
Given that frustration, what kinds of policy ideas is the White House floating, and how are experts reacting?
President Trump has floated capping credit card interest rates at 10%, banning big institutional investors from buying up single-family homes, and selectively suspending some of his own tariffs to take pressure off specific goods. Those ideas, which have been outlined in coverage on financial sites and network interviews, are aimed squarely at kitchen table issues like debt and housing. But the American Bankers Association and other nonpartisan groups caution that as long as the Fed keeps rates in what they still call a hawkish range, borrowing for mortgages, cars, and small businesses will stay costly. That leaves many families caught in a pincer between stubborn prices on one side and high financing costs on the other.
Stepping back, what's the big picture story economists are seeing in this December report, especially with midterm elections coming next year?
Michael Pierce at Oxford Economics told reporters this report reinforces the idea that inflation has likely peaked and is slowly grinding down, which is the good news. The bad news is that, as NPR and the New York Times have both emphasized, the easy part was cooling the headline rate. Now comes the hard part of lowering the pressure on things like rent, food, and energy that people can't easily cut back on. Those are areas where supply, infrastructure, and global forces matter as much as interest rates, so the Fed can't fix them alone. With midterms in November of next year, that leaves both the administration and the central bank facing a long, politically fraught stretch where the data may keep improving on paper, but many households still feel like they're just treading water.
A lot for families, markets, and the Fed to watch in the next couple of weeks. Chloe, thanks for breaking all of that down. Here are some other headlines. Justices are weighing who gets to play. On January 13th, the Supreme Court heard West Virginia versus BPJ and Little versus Hecox, testing state bans on transgender women and girls in school sports. The conservative majority sounded ready to uphold the laws. Justice Brett Kavanaugh said letting transgender athletes compete could undermine women's sports. Athletes, lawyers argue the bans violate equal protection and Title IX, while Idaho and West Virginia say biological sex is what matters. A decision expected in 2026 will shape bans in 27 states and a federal threat to cut funds from schools that let transgender girls play. China's export engine hit $1 trillion turbo boost, with customs officials reporting a record $1.19 trillion trade surplus for 2025, the first time the balance has cleared trillion mark. Exports grew while imports stayed flat. Vice Minister Wang Jun called global conditions severe and complex, but said fundamentals remain solid as China diversifies its customers. Shipments to the U.S. fell roughly 20% after tariffs were reimposed, but sales to ASEAN, Africa, and Latin America kept the cargo moving. Partners fear industrial overcapacity, especially Chinese electric vehicles and green tech, could turn open markets into no parking zones. Claudette Colvin, the teenager whose defiance helped launch the civil rights movement, has died at 86. At 15, in March 1955, she refused to surrender her seat on a segregated Montgomery bus, 9 months before Rosa Parks, later saying, "History had me glued to the seat." Long overshadowed, she became a key plaintiff and star witness in Browder v. Gale, the case that led the Supreme Court in 1956 to strike down bus segregation. She died Tuesday, January 13th, at a hospice in Texas. In 2021, her 66-year-old juvenile record was expunged, finally clearing her name. Japan is racing to the polls, with Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi telling coalition leaders she'll dissolve the lower house on January 23rd and call a snap election expected on February 8th. Riding strong ratings, she's betting voters will back her, proactive, spending plans, and faster military buildup. The vote will test the Liberal Democratic Party's new alliance with the Japan Innovation Party, after a split with Komeito. Markets cheered, but opposition lawmakers call the move a selfish stunt that could delay a record 122.3 trillion yen budget and, if it backfires, weaken Japan's first female prime minister just months into her term. A ProPublica investigation from North Carolina is putting heart-stopping detail behind life-saving exception. It describes how 34-year-old Greensboro police officer C.G. Graham, who had atrial fibrillation, was denied a routine cardioversion because she was pregnant and doctors feared violating abortion restrictions. When she later tried to end the pregnancy to protect her health, clinics deemed her too high risk and hospitals hesitated over possible prosecution. She died of heart failure. Experts who reviewed more than 500 pages of records called her death preventable and say it is the 7th documented case in a restrictive state where pregnancy plus politics proved fatal. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.